This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It is 3 minutes after 10 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I can't work on the presumption that you listen to the programme religiously. I can't even, given the speed and the way in which audiences grow and shift and flow and ebb. I can't even presume that you will be particularly familiar with my own personal bugbears and enthusiasms. But I'd hope by now you might have picked up on the fact that I think the Daily Mail newspaper, more than any other organ, including the ones owned by Rupert Murdoch, has done untold damage to the fabric of this country, to community relations, to, when you bring Brexit into the picture, to everything from our economy right through to our standard of living. But I hadn't fully appreciated the role that it played in discouraging people from vaccinating their children against measles. I had no idea that columnists like Melanie Phillips, who normally writes about how awful Muslims are, had spent years writing about how awful MMR jabs are, or that Paul Dacre, the editor-in-chief that Boris Johnson wanted to put both in the House of Lords and in charge of the broadcasting regulator Ofcom, had presided over it all with characteristic arrogance. And I mean, you know, where does that lead us? Well, it leads us today to the news that measles cases in the West Midlands have been at their highest level since the mid-90s, and it has prompted the government to launch a campaign urging every child born the year after the MMR scare to get a booster jab. I write a lot in my newish book, How They Broke Britain, which is still £10 on Amazon, by the way. I write a lot about how the worst thing about what's happened to our country in the last 30 years is the way that the people who do terrible things to us, whether it's encouraging us to vote for Brexit or encouraging us not to vaccinate our children, don't ever face any consequences. Absolute impunity. The same people that dedicate 13 pages to Keir Starmer's curry in the hope of distracting us from the fact that Boris Johnson has been breaking his own laws and lying about it, and then lying about it, the same people are responsible for, in large part, the country's failure to understand, or the country being completely misled over the MMR issue. More than 50 children have been hospitalised since December in Birmingham alone. Now that is more than admissions in total across the entire NHS in any year since before the pandemic. So just stop and think. Just do the sums. This isn't an opinion, it's counting. 50 children in a single month in a single city admitted to hospital. That's more than any year in total across the country. It's more than the national figure for an entire year. So the Birmingham figure for a single month is higher than the national figure for an entire year up to the beginning of the pandemic. There are two ways into this. I make no apology for offending you if you are in the category I'm about to describe. I don't want to talk to you if you are a passionate anti-vaxxer. It is a position that I acknowledge the existence of. That's all. And I appreciate that there are people being paid money to encourage you to endanger yourselves and the entire population, but I'm not one of them. So sling your hook, as they say. However, there are other categories of people to whom I'm keen to speak, and indeed about whom I'm keen to speak, because there will not be a single answer to the question. It can't all be the fault of Paul Dacre at the Daily Mail. There will be many other reasons why the herd immunity built up by years of inoculations has been so severely compromised. Uptake among children born in 1988 onwards waned following the publishing that year of debunked and discredited research claiming links between the vaccine and autism. The paper was later found to have used falsified data, and Wakefield was struck off. So that's reason number one. More than 1 million people aged 11 to 25 across the measles-hit West Midlands and London are now being invited to get missed MMR jabs. It's the first ever NHS vaccination catch-up campaign targeting adults as well as children. So what I want to know, what I want to do is find out why it's happening. And I want to explore the possibility that some of it is actually behavioural as opposed to propagandal. Propagandal. I think I just invented a word. It's only 8 minutes. It's a good word though, propagandal. What would be the propagandal? I like that word. Propagandalf. Propaganda. Anyway, I think that there will just be, because there's two things going on at least. There's two, what would you call it, forces aligning here. One will be and I have some sympathy for the people who fell for Andrew Wakefield's bogus research and subsequently for the Daily Mail's dismal and potentially lethal journalism, because your mum took that paper every day for 30 years. It didn't cross your mind that it was being edited in such an irresponsible and dangerous fashion. But equally, the NHS has also struggled, particularly, of course, since 2010. And the public health provision has been severely compromised by what Tories like to call austerity, but which more sensible people call taking money out of society to further enrich its very richest members. And therefore, public health messaging has diminished. The idea of encouraging people to look after themselves has come under unprecedented attack from weirdos who congregate around a single street in Westminster called Tufton Street. These secretly funded organisations with fancy-sounding names and season tickets for appearing on programmes everywhere from the BBC to LBC are dedicated to promoting the idea that governments shouldn't spend money on looking after citizens. The money should instead stay in the pockets of the people who secretly fund these weird organisations. And therefore, the messaging, I think, has perhaps not reached the people in the way that it should have done. So, question number one. In your experience / opinion, why are people not vaccinating their children, or why have people not vaccinated their children? And I'll take anything you've got on that. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. But the second one, and I need to stress, measles is a very infectious virus that can cause serious illness and even death in children and adults. If it is caught during pregnancy, it can lead to stillbirth, miscarriage, and low birth weight. There's no treatment for it particularly, but it can be prevented. The MMR vaccine is not only safe but highly effective, with about 99% of people protected against measles after 2 doses. So why have people not done it, in your experience? 0345 6060 973. And then the second element of this conversation that we stumbled across during COVID, actually, for fairly obvious reasons. I want to know what it's like to deal with someone who thinks they know better than the doctors, who thinks they know better than the science. So, I mean, what do you do? I saw something on Twitter on Friday, and it was someone, he wasn't just boasting about not getting his children vaccinated. He was outraged that his GP, when they told the GP this, his GP said, well, you're the reason why there's a measles pandemic. Someone will send me the tweet. So I didn't want to draw attention to it or retweet it because it was just it was a relatively low follower account, but someone had picked up on it because it appeared in a conversation about measles. And it wasn't just the fact that he was so confident in his ignorance. It was the genuine sense of outrage that he was being blamed for the measles outbreak. The people who have not vaccinated their children are culpable for this. If somebody dies as a consequence of catching measles because herd immunity has been severely, violently diminished, then the people who have not vaccinated their children are all, in a sense, culpable. I mean, not under law or anything like that, because you've been led to this position through propaganda and I think I'm allowed to say ignorance. I don't want to upset you at this early stage, but the idea that your children might be at school with children who are not vaccinated, the idea that you might be sitting next to someone at work who's not vaccinated, you might have been on the bus today with someone who's not vaccinated, and the likelihood of that, well, in 2016, the UK was measles free. So what they think the problem might be now is people who perhaps had one jab but didn't have the booster are having their immunity compromised. So how do you deal with it? What do you do? And I want to try and keep it to measles. In fact, I'm going to insist that we keep it to measles. What do you do if your sister says, "Oh, I'm not having my children vaccinated"? How do you and post Wakefield, post being struck off, an actual doctor being actually struck off, how do people end up still thinking that they shouldn't inoculate their children against measles? How do you win this argument? Because already I've been quite rude to people who probably don't deserve insults. Usually I'm very sympathetic towards people who've had their brains boiled by Paul Dacre and the Daily Mail. And therefore I should be sympathetic to people who've had their children's health compromised and therefore the health of everybody around them compromised, who have had their herd immunity as any member of the population diluted by Paul Dacre and the Daily Mail. Remember the man that Boris Johnson wanted to put in the House of Lords. Incredible, really, to reflect on that simple fact. But there we are. Normally the people who get put in the House of Lords are people who've done incredible work improving things like herd immunity, people whose commitment to science has been of a great benefit to the population. Boris Johnson wanted to put someone in the House of Lords who presided over the precise opposite, which is a little odd. But then, I've given up trying to analyse what motivates that man. But I do want to know what motivates you. Figures for 2022-2023 show that only 84.5% of children in England had received the second MMR vaccine dose by 5 years of age. So the problem seems to be kids who had the first one but didn't have the second one, which would explain why in 2016 the UK was declared measles-free, but in 2023 we've got a problem. Feel free to educate me as well. I'm no scientist, so if there's elements of this that you think demand further clarification, then I want to hear it. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Question number one, why is this happening? And that's a very personal answer. 0345 6060 973. And question number two, how do you deal? What's the best way to deal with somebody? You know, my catchphrase for Brexit was contempt for the con men, compassion for the conned. What's the best way to deal with somebody who has been so dangerously misled on this issue? Or what's it like to have one in your life? What's it like to be married to one? I mean, there's a lot to cover here. Let's get stuck in. It's 10:16.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
19 after 10 is the time. Amy writes, I'm of an age when if the doctor told you to do something, you did it. Mum and I were discussing this, and I feel that in this information-ready world we now live in, it's easy for people to feel more informed, but less easy for them to see when they're being misled. I think you're probably right. That's from Amy in Cornwall. So, modernity will have a part to play in this measles crisis, as indeed with the internet. And, the sense, as someone's put it a little bit more rudely, why would you want to listen to experts who've spent their lives studying something when you can just find some no mark on the internet to tell you what's really going on? Similarly, don't forget thalidomide. So the idea of doing what a doctor says is not always, or in that famous case, and Imprimadol as well, of course, which my friend Jason Farrell has covered so expertly and comprehensively, that there are historical examples of doctors getting something horribly wrong. But MMR moved out of that spotlight decades ago, and yet here we are. So whatever you've got in answer to this question, I want to assemble a bunch of reasons, because it won't just be down to Paul Dacre and the Daily Mail. Ursula's in Worthing. Ursula, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello.
I'm a first-time caller.
Well, you're very welcome.
And I felt that I had to call about this because I do feel really strongly about it.
Go on.
My daughter was born in 1997, and when she was 2, that was when I think the Andrew Wakefield thing all blew up.
Right.
And the newspapers, particularly the Mail, which I don't get, but I read about, and yes, all of the mothers were talking about it, was full of, oh, your child's going to get autism, be responsible, and it's terribly kind of emotive.
Yes.
You know, you want to look after your child. You've had this baby. You're absolutely in love with it. You absolutely want to do what's best for you. And there is some peer pressure. You know, I was kind of living on Muesli Mountain, and everybody's going, you know, this
I've not heard that phrase before. Is that a thing? That's wonderful. So people so people who are quite right on, as it were, or it was Muesli Mountain.
And we really did, you know, and we were educated, and you know, most of us had degrees and things. And the point that I want to make is that we had health visitors then.
Yes.
And I think Claire Gerardi made this yesterday on Radio 4. The health visitors were incredible. And not just for uneducated kind of people that needed child protection, but for all of us. I talked to my health visitor and I said, look, I've got real concerns about this. The whole, you know, the newspapers are full of this. I don't want to, you know, in the wake of thalidomide and other kind of drugs that children have been given.
Yes.
I don't want to give my child something that might damage it.
And even so, I'm glad you're first up today, because you err towards generosity of spirit, albeit you're using your own experience to do so. You're doing your own experience to do so, and that is essentially almost saying better safe than sorry. And you didn't have loud enough voices on the other side warning you about what would happen if you didn't do it.
Well, it was interesting because what she did was, I was lucky. I don't know, there were lots of more resources in those days. I got to talk to an immunologist.
Right.
Who sat me down and said, look, Ursula, you're so fortunate to have a child that is well and healthy and it may survive measles.
Yes.
You know, it's like COVID. You know, you've got a chance that you'll get through COVID. But there are so many other children there that if they get measles, they could die or go blind or go deaf.
Well, I've already heard from one lady who did indeed go deaf as a child as a consequence of catching me. I caught measles when I was 6. It left me deaf in my left ear. It's not worth risking your child's health, says Catherine Scarborough.
Exactly. And, you know, I kind of did it because I thought, you know, I'm a good citizen. I'm part of a community. We have the NHS.
That's why we use the word heard.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
And I trusted doctors because there had been this hoo-ha about it. We have been through some.
And the health service became a tribune of the people, really. And in your case, the health visitor played a role in steering you away from what the media was doing.
And I feel really strongly about reinstating health visitors because I think that they're a fantastic resource.
I don't think they've gone away, have they? They're just doing more work with less support.
We used to get a midwife visit for 10 days after the birth every day.
Right.
I don't think that happens anymore.
No, I remember getting that as well. She told me the house was too cold. I'll always remember that. We'd been warned about having the house too warm, so we'd turn the heating off. The first thing she said when she walked in was, "Crikey, it's freezing in here." So I thought, why have we got... Anyway, I digress slightly. So that there you go. There has been a dilution of the forces that would once have been dedicated to battling the propaganda. It's Muesli. So Muesli Mountain is actually a place, Ursula. It's not a figure of speech.
Well, I say Muesli Mountain. I was actually in West London. My friend,
but there is a place in Brighton called Hanover.
Brighton, is that... Yes, Hanover. My friend. That's where I got that's
right.
That's the place.
Well, every day's a school day, isn't it? You live and learn. 24 minutes after 10 is the time. Thank you, Ursula. Steve's in Walthamstow. Steve, what made you pick up the phone?
I just wanted to say. So I'm in a situation where I'm no longer with my partner, but we raised our daughter together, and she spends half the week with each of us, and her mum doesn't believe in vaccines or any form of modern science, which is the opposite of me, and it's a really tricky situation because I feel like I've been threatened with, if I get her vaccinated, not being able to see my child.
And this includes MMR?
This includes everything. I'm not.
Where is she getting her? What's her sort of inspiration, for want of a better word? What star does she follow, as it were?
She seemed to be less following this star, so-called, when we were together, and the longer it's gone on, she's followed it further. But following this nihilistic sort of direction to nothing, where all science is fatal almost.
Did she go down rabbit holes in the lockdown?
It wasn't even lockdown. She was building the bridges beforehand,
right?
And it was more a slow build as opposed to being stuck in lockdown. But it was there beforehand. I mean, when we had the child,
okay,
I was surprised when she mentioned it. I wasn't expecting it, and I thought it was a conversation that we could have.
What if?
And then it became a situation where, it was a zero sum.
What if your child was like seriously ill and there was a well established course of treatment? Would she be resistant to that? Do you think? I hope that never happens.
I believe if it was something really, really fatal, she would bend, but
right.
situations that we would consider quite severe,
gosh,
she wouldn't. It was just quite hard to deal with.
Oh, it's horrible to deal with. What, have you taken advice, if you don't mind me asking? Because I would have thought that she'd be on very thin ice legally if she were to be depriving you of custody for being the responsible parent in the partnership.
No, well, I suppose the issue is because I live what's called a semi-transient life.
Okay.
So I live on a boat.
Yeah.
In London, but I own the boat. I've got a long-term job.
Yeah.
I've got a long-term career. I've got everything settled down. But it means I don't have a set address.
Okay. Sure.
So when it comes down to legal proceedings, it makes everything very tricky.
And
it
she knows
almost feels
that.
like it shouldn't be.
What about? I mean, is it worth me asking if anyone's got any advice for you on how to deal with her directly, or do you feel that you've tried everything, you've exhausted every avenue?
I mean, I would take advice, but
because one of the earliest,
we're in a situation where I know what I think's okay, but the threat of not seeing a child is
too much to bear.
Everything.
Of course, it does. I mean, it is. I think the best way into it. Shalina has messaged me to suggest that people don't know how awful and how dangerous it is. I mean, they really don't appreciate just how terrible it can be. Like Kath in Scarborough going deaf when she was 6, and the possibility of death, or if someone pregnant catches it, the likelihood of stillbirth. They're possibly, because you almost then become. We all, as a society, become victims of the success of the vaccine. 2016, not a single case. So there are not stories in our shared narrative about how awful it can be. Most of us don't know a Kath. And if we do, we might not know why she's deaf. So as it succeeds, so the sort of natural social process of warning each other against how terrible something is recedes, because its impact has diminished as a consequence of the previous generational success in warning each other about how terrible it is. Do you see what I mean?
So I get fed information from her side saying, well, actually, these diseases were disappearing anyway. So
right.
It's not
regardless. So the fact that there were no measles cases in 2016 has absolutely nothing to do with decades of successful measles inoculation.
It's absolutely nothing to do with vaccines that polio disappeared. It's to do with safer water or something like that.
Right.
That's what she said. But
well, other people, this is not a solo furrow that she ploughs, Steve. So perhaps someone who's been in it, or someone who has come to the aid of someone who is in it, has been stuck in it, might have something helpful to suggest that you haven't heard before. But I'm certainly not patronising you by suggesting that there will be any easiest or obvious solutions to the intractable nature of what you've just described. As you can say until you're blue in the face, here's the science, and someone will respond saying, oh no, here's the woo. It is 10:30, and Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:34 is the time. That extraordinary statistic in your news bulletin there, the work of my colleague here at LBC, Connor Hand. 84 NHS trusts and health boards consulted through freedom of information requests. And this is the coalface of journalism, really, in a way. This is the, the legwork, the heavy lifting in the hope rather than the expectation of pay dirt. And I think this counts as pay dirt. 13,000 diagnoses of malnutrition in Rishi Sunak's first year as Prime Minister, 15,000 cases of rickets and more than 150 cases of scurvy in the first 12 months of Rishi Sunak's premiership. These are, of course, conditions that can be fairly described as Victorian and indeed haven't been particularly commonplace since the Victorian era. And what Connor has done is look at secondary diagnoses as opposed to the simple NHS digital figures that place the number of people hospitalised at just over 10,000. You look at the secondary figures and therefore end up with numbers that could be 3 times higher than previous estimates. And that's just from a third. So there's adjustment for the fact that only around a third of hospital trusts responded to our requests in time. So the true figures could be as high as 450 for scurvy or 39,000 for malnutrition and 45,000 for rickets. I say what you want about that. It's dismal. 40 Tory MPs today calling for more money to be spent on councils, which is weird. Is there anything on the agenda this year that might means people who've spent their entire careers calling for cuts, austerity, don't blame the bankers, let's shut some libraries? Anything on the agenda? No. Oh, an election that they think they're going to lose. No, don't be so cynical. And how dare anyone suggest that Tory attitudes to the NHS are responsible for a shocking rise in Victorian-era diseases? It's probably a consequence of coincidence. 10:37 is the time. And speaking of consequences, why have people not vaccinated their children? Or why have people not been vaccinated on a scale that has seen the country in the space of 7 years go from having no cases of measles at all, being a measles-free population, in the space of 7 years to being a place where there were more cases in a single city in a single month at the end of last year than there had been in entire years for the entire population up until 3 years ago. Natasha is in Yeovil. Natasha, what would you like to say?
My point is, you're saying about people not vaccinating their children, and what do you say to try and encourage them to?
Yes.
My mother didn't vaccinate me due to advice of me being a premature baby. I got measles when I was 5. Due to that, I'm deaf in one ear.
Right.
I had balance issues for years. And unfortunately, my 3-month-old brother also then got measles because I got measles. And he died. Oh. So my mother had to cope with the guilt of not having me vaccinated, the death of my brother, the health issues that went with having had measles, balance issues, accidents. I used to give Christmas presents to the local nurse in our community hospital. So I used to have so many balance-related and distance issues. So I'd run into walls because I couldn't get perception correct.
Oh, gosh.
And fall off walls and all sorts of stuff. But yes, so that's what I tell people. One, it's debunked autism. It's proven.
Yes.
And the consequences of your child might get a little bit poorly for a few days, slight temperature from having a vaccine,
yes,
compared to lifelong guilt.
Well, I think the official advice now is that because you're at a higher risk of infection, you need the same vaccinations at 2 months old as babies born at full term. And was it in that window that you caught it?
It was in that window, and my mum, being an ex-hippie, etc., didn't do it. Right. So she probably now would say something very different, but then she was advised not to, so she didn't. Yes, no, I was tiny. I was only 2 pounds 1 ounce in 1978.
Gosh.
So they didn't push it, and she wasn't encouraged to. But then, obviously, the consequence was my little tiny brother, who didn't have the ability to fight it, died.
I'm sorry.
Oh no! I mean, it's 40
I know,
odd years
but still,
ago.
it's a horrible business. Did your mum ever forgive herself? Can you forgive yourself?
No, she never forgave herself. I mean, my mother's had depression and alcoholism for a long, long time now, and yes, it's all about. I mean, she's always said to me that one day she'll be able to be the mother she wanted to be to Toby, because she does believe in faith and God and afterlife and everything. So she knows at some point she'll be reunited with him. And I think that's the only reason she's still here.
Gosh, because of that hope. And you have rung in today because there are people listening to this who are tempted by or halfway down the path that your mother followed. Yes,
absolutely. And I think it's becoming. I think the COVID issue has kicked it up even more.
Yeah, of course.
Because people are so terrified of that vaccine. And my sister-in-law wouldn't vaccinate my niece because she'd read something that meant that maybe my niece wouldn't be able to get pregnant in later life. And that's, again, all been debunked.
Yes, of course.
But
how did that make you feel? How did that make you feel? I mean, because I don't know why. I think it's because of what I do for a living, Natasha. I'm always struck by people who shock or amaze my listeners with their own personal stories, and then it turns out that there's someone in your immediate orbit, your immediate family, who is not as shaken by what you have been through and what you've told us as we are. I always find that slightly strange. How did you feel when your sister-in-law adopted what is essentially an anti-vax attitude?
I think you have to understand, and it has to be their choice.
Yes.
I've explained my point. We also have, I've rung before because I'm a carer for a disabled child. Yes. I have a daughter with Rett syndrome, so we were quarantined for nearly 18 months with COVID. And she couldn't come, even when we did relax the rules, I didn't let them anywhere near us, so we didn't see. And it's damaged our relationship, because not seeing them for nearly 18 months.
Yeah, and the cousins' relationship's been a bit damaged as well, no doubt.
Absolutely. But I understand, and I do understand. I also have an evangelical godmother who is also very anti-vaxxer.
I feel like I should shout bingo at some point during this conversation, Natasha.
I can do the bingo card, but I just debate. I'm a great debater. I like debating. I like putting my point forward, but I also like accepting people's decisions.
Yes.
I struggle with measles because it's such a preventable condition.
Yes.
It's so preventable. As you said, we didn't have it for nearly 5 years. We were nearly completely free, and then, as you said, in 2016 it was gone.
Remarkable turnaround, isn't it? So try this from Emma. See what you think. They write, there's no advising a vaccine denialist. It needs deprogramming therapy in a similar vein to Q, and they won't consent to that if they don't think they're not in a cult.
I think we're becoming for example, on social media, you start, it learns what you want to see and what you want to hear and what you're interested in. So you can, for example, on TikTok, I'm on the Democrat side of the American TikToks that come through, because I'm very much not on the Republican side. And then the same in this country, I'm much more Labour liberal. So I don't see a huge amount or pay much attention actually to the Conservative Party, other than to get really angry.
Yeah, sure.
I think you can find what you want to find, and you can find the proof that backs up your opinion, even if it isn't actual proof. But it's there.
You can always find it. I mean, there's one here actually while you were speaking. The nano particle gene therapy technology has been causing lots of infant mortality and miscarriages. So I don't think that's been sent as a joke. That's someone who has swallowed wholesale abject gibberish. Meaningless gibberish, actually, for anyone with a scientific training listening. Just a jumble of words.
But
that's all you need. What do you think it is? So you don't have to stay. I know you probably weren't expecting to be on for this long, and I know how busy you are. But what, is there a character type? Do you think there is a character that is more susceptible to this than others? Or is that a silly question?
I don't think it's a silly question, but I think it's a really difficult question to answer. I still like to read. I still like to check things out. I use Google to back up. For example, I'll look at something will be said, and I'm like, oh, that doesn't sound right. So I'll go and have a look. I have friends that are in the GP side of the world,
Right,
and I
yes.
hear how frustrated they are.
It must be awful.
But I think we've also, and I don't mean this to sound like I'm literally blaming everything on the governments of the world, but I am. It trickles down.
Yeah.
So the attitude of me, which is in this country, for example, is definitely what's being trickled down from the Tories.
Yes.
It's me. It's not, we'll do everything for everyone.
But it's odd that.
I mean, it's even this morning with the chap saying about he was in the army and he doesn't want his children to join, or they don't want to join.
Yes.
When listening to Nick this morning, and he was saying that it was all very much a team thing. I
Yes.
don't think this country is about everybody anymore.
Well,
I think
except that conspiracy theories do give a sense of belonging. They do give a sense of
Yes, they do.
tribalism.
Yes, and I think we all want that. And I think because communities
so
are
you
going...
take it where you find it, and
Yeah,
because it's not,
I think-
you can't find it in traditional spaces. So you take it
No,
where you
there's no
find it.
pubs anymore. There's no pub culture. There's no going down to the tea room and having a cup of tea with your friends. There's none of that.
That's really
Where
interesting.
groups would get together. I don't think that since COVID they've gone. I think a lot more people just sit at home on their screens.
And as a consequence of that, you can end up persuading yourself that everybody who's doing what we do, or I'm being paid to have this conversation, you're not, so anybody who does what I do must be part of the conspiracy. I mean, you've made me think of George Soros, from whom I'm still waiting for all my checks to arrive, or the idea that Bill Gates has somehow embarked upon a nefarious path as he sought to eradicate polio from Africa. And my text box proves the point. This is a genuine text, I think, from a real human. When does your contract for selling the deadly vaccine run out? Because, of course, you can't listen to people like Natasha and me talking complete sense without having to seek to persuade yourself that you're the one who knows the real truth, and these people must therefore be bad actors or dishonest. By bad actors, I mean people doing bad things. I don't mean the lad from Lewis who wasn't Lewis. It's 10:47.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 to 11, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It's funny, actually. You mentioned a presenter on one of these new TV stations who's constantly pushing these wacky conspiracy theories. It's like shouting fire in a crowded cinema. These paid shills must be held to account in the courts. I suppose that's why our friend here thinks that I'm being paid to promote vaccines, because it's the accusation levelled at people telling lies. I don't know that they are. I mean, they get paid to present a programme on a sort of weird TV channel. But I don't know how you'd actually be able to trouser money from people encouraging you to persuade people to believe absolute nonsense. And don't forget, some of the people on the screen believe it as well. Funnily enough, the Culture Secretary, Lucy Fraser, has described that particular broadcaster as having balance across the spectrum, which is quite extraordinary, really. Part of the reason why the MMR scandal took hold was because the Daily Mail, once again, was the tail that wagged the BBC dog. So there were stand-up rows, I'm told, in BBC newsrooms, because editors felt that you should always put forward the sort of Wakefield argument, the link with a completely debunked and discredited now link with autism. But that's BBC balance in place once again. Editors probably not even realising consciously that because it's all over the Daily Mail, which at the time was the second best-selling newspaper in the country, then it can't be complete hogwash because it's in the Daily Mail. I think a similar thing happened with Brexit. Even quite intelligent people would have looked at Brexit and thought, hang on a minute, how can leaving the European Union possibly be good for us? And how can they talk about sovereignty when anybody with a brain knows that there's no such thing in the context of trade deals? A trade deal literally involves a compromise, and the minute you have a compromise, you're diluting your own sovereignty. I mean, none of this stuff makes sense, but hang on a minute, they wouldn't be dedicating page and page and page after page after page to telling us what a great idea Brexit is in my daily newspaper if it was complete cobblers, just as they wouldn't be dedicating page after page after page telling me not to vaccinate my children if that was complete cobblers as well. But there we are. Paul Dacre's legacy to the country. 10:53 is the time. Have a listen to this clip of Lucy Fraser, the Culture Secretary, because I think once again, as with Susan Hall, whose interview with Nick this morning was masterful, actually, I have to say. Global Player, you can rewind. Some people laughed when Susan Hall was appointed to be the mayoral candidate for London, I've heard a whisper of some slightly shenanigan-flavoured reasons as to why she got the nod instead of the widely respected former Minister for London, Paul Scully. I shall share those with you if and when I've managed to firm them up. But many people laughed when Susan Hall got the nod, with her long history of retweeting praise for Enoch Powell and her admiration for Donald Trump, two notorious racists. But of course, that sort of behaviour doesn't preclude you from promotion in the post-Brexit Tory party. And then a questionable grasp of the fact. Well, the people who laughed when Susan Hall was given the nod to be the Conservatives candidate for London Mayor, they're not laughing now. They're having full-blown hysterics. It's quite the development. And this is also a brilliant interview and more illustration of the shallowness of the talent puddle from which the Tory party is now reduced to drawing its appointments. This is Lucy Fraser, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, about whom you could say at least one thing in her favour. There is no chance whatsoever of her being the stupidest ever Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. And that's something to which she will be eternally grateful to Nadine Dorries.
Do you think the BBC is biased?
Well, I am looking at this from the point of view of the Culture Secretary.
Yeah, and that's why I'm asking you.
And
so do you think they're biased?
And the evidence shows that there is a perception of bias in relation to the BBC.
What do you think? Do you think, as Culture Secretary, that the BBC is biased?
I think that on occasion it has been biased, yes.
In relation to what?
Well, this report isn't about incidents, but we have seen recently that it's had to apologise for its own reporting, for example, in relation to the attack in the hospital in Israel, so in Gaza.
What's the difference between mistake and bias, surely?
Well, there is a perception amongst the public that the BBC is biased, and as Culture Secretary, it's important that I look at that. I must say, these are issues that I have discussed with the BBC. They've taken on board.
Yeah, but I'm asking you about the evidence of bias. Where's the evidence?
The evidence of bias is what audiences believe is the content of the BBC and
but that's
how
perception,
they.
That's not evidence. That's perception.
That is evidence. That is evidence. Impartiality is about perception of the things that are being broadcast by the BBC, and the evidence in relation to that perception is that
perception and evidence are different things.
The evidence from Ofcom, having done studies and questionnaires of the public, is that the BBC's ratings in relation to impartiality have gone down. And I and the BBC think that there is more that the BBC can do in order to improve that.
Which other broadcasters are you investigating? Which other broadcasters do you feel potentially are not impartial?
The reason we've done this review is because the BBC is in a special position.
Yeah, but I'm asking you which other broadcasters you think are not impartial.
My job as the Culture Secretary is to... It has a special role in relation to the BBC, and the reason for that is because the BBC is funded by the public.
It's Kay Burley there on Sky News this morning, pointing out that the Culture Secretary thinks that people believing the BBC is biased is evidence of the BBC being biased, despite the fact she can't actually provide any evidence of the BBC being biased. Which is, I mean, it's almost an advert for how they broke Britain, the way in which this is the Daily Mail constantly telling you that the BBC is biased, people in my line of work constantly telling you that the BBC is biased, Gary Lineker being served up by people who resent the fact that an ordinary man from a working class background is not only as intelligent and as informed as them, but he is not remotely bigoted. For that, he cannot be forgiven. How dare Gary Lineker have an enormous... So they're constantly telling you that the BBC is biased. The BBC is biased. The BBC is biased. And then a proportion of the public turns around and says, I think the BBC is biased. And the Conservative Secretary of State for Culture says that's the proof that the BBC is biased. Robbie Gibb is currently on the board at the BBC. He was Director of Communications in Theresa May's government, literally, 10 minutes ago in 10 Downing Street, currently on the board of the BBC, lecturing journalists on how they should handle stories, telling them what issues are and are not salient or newsworthy, and getting involved in the appointment of people to senior positions in the corporation. Also, Alan Rusbridger, the former editor of The Guardian, now editor of Prospect, has been conducting a fascinating investigation into allegations made by the only Secretary of State for Culture to be even worse than Lucy Fraser, the sainted Nadine Dorries, allegations that Robbie Gibb was involved in sharp practices designed to get his favoured candidate into the chairmanship of the BBC. So extraordinary, or the chairmanship of Ofcom, I forget which, forgive me, nobody's perfect. So extraordinary evidence of massive Tory infiltration and bias in plain sight. And yet the Secretary of State for Culture thinks it's biased the other way and has no evidence for that, except for the fact that some people have had their brains boiled by extremely biased media. See, there's a reason why client journalism works. That's it. People believe it. Even as some of us spend our lives pointing out to you how complete the attempts to mislead and indeed to brainwash you are. It is coming up to 11 o'clock. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm not quite sure what to do next. Keir Starmer has showed a bit of leg on the issue of wokeness. I think it's a really interesting development, actually, but it does lead us into the sort of territory where we compare notes on what we think of a policy decision or a policy movement. I would like to know what you think of his decision to actually make a stand on an issue that the Tories have, well, up until this point, pretty much owned.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11 is the time. Okay, this is. You can tell what day of the week it is sometimes by the topics that I choose. I get a little bit tired as the week goes on. It's probably my age. You do too. I know you do. That's why sometimes we're desperate for the weekend to arrive. So this is a thinky one, I think. This is quite a thinky one. But it is political, and we might be bringing the B word into the conversation in the next hour. So that'll be your little reward for doing your homework on this subject. Keir Starmer. And I think the question I'm going to ask you is probably going to be along the lines of, do you like this move? Because again, what did he do last week that I thought was genius? He moved behind the notion of a nanny state, didn't he? I thought that was a really interesting development. I mean, he didn't go all in on it, and it was partly as a consequence of Natasha Clark's deft questioning. But he made it pretty clear that he sees the role of government as being to help the population, which is actually a tragic and almost unbelievable though it may be. It's in stark contrast to the recent direction of traffic, where the role of government is to remove state influence and intervention from as much of British life as possible, so that the private sector and profiteers can hoover up ever more of the cash in the pot, in the public pot, or indeed in the private pot. So he did that, didn't he? He said he doesn't think the nanny state's a bad idea, and that's a very interesting shift, I think, especially with that caution that he's displayed so far. That almost, it seems sometimes, reluctance to hang his hat on any hooks. So I liked that, and I think that's deeply significant. And this is really interesting as well. I don't fully grasp. I'm always wary of attributing things I don't understand being pursued by people I find a little bit repellent, I think is the word I'm looking for. I'm always a little bit wary of attributing it all to xenophobia or jingoism. And then I often feel a little bit stupid 10 minutes later when it becomes incredibly obvious that it is all about xenophobia and jingoism. But the enmity that's been directed at the National Trust and the RNLI, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, of all the things that have happened in the last 2 years, of all the desperate attempts by pro-Brexit publications and politicians to enrage their base with new targets, to distract from the fact that destroying the last target has turned out to be an epic act of self-harm, but in order to keep you angry. This is why Sunak used phrases like will of the people to talk about his ludicrous Rwanda bill. The will of which people? I mean, even among Conservative voters, the polling doesn't show a special support for it. The will of the people and foreign courts. It's as if a really bad tribute act is touring the clubs, doing the songs that the original act would knock out of the park. So you take someone like Boris Johnson, and when he gives you 5 bars of will of the people, then there are women in the front row throwing their knickers at the stage. Almost literally, sadly, in his case. So he'll give you, and now coming up next, it's Boris Johnson with the will of the people. And he gives you the will of the people, and the crowd are lapping it up. They're cheering it to the rafters. Or he'll give you, get Brexit done. Here's Boris Johnson with his latest smash hit, all the way from Islington, North London. Boris Johnson! And he comes on stage and he starts singing Get Brexit Done, and everybody loves it. Or he'll give you Down with Foreign Courts. Here's Boris Johnson, and now all the way from Islington, all the way from Lord Bamford's garden, where he lived for a long time after leaving Downing Street. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Other rich people have peacocks strutting around their garden to show off to their peers and their guests. Bamford, the bloke who owns JCB, another big Brexiter, he somehow ended up with a disgraced Prime Minister living in his back garden, and one presumes that he mixes in social circles where that would be considered impressive. But here now with his latest smash hit, Boris Johnson, and Down with Foreign Court. So the greatest hits of Boris Johnson. Will of the people. Down with Foreign Courts. Up with me. And of course, get Brexit done. Rishi Sunak now is like, you know, Stars in Their Eyes were quite good performers, weren't there? Is there a show where really bad tribute acts come on stage and everyone laughs at how unlike the original act they actually are? So Sunak is trying to do the greatest hits of Boris Johnson now, having played a key role in getting rid of him and promising to deliver a different approach to politics. Sunak is now doing Boris Johnson's greatest hits very, very badly. And he can't quite, one of the things that's really interesting, he can't quite understand why the crowd aren't cheering. And then he gets a little bit petulant. And you can see the cross little schoolboy inside him. Well, hang on a minute. When Boris Johnson sang Will of the People, everybody cheered. There were women throwing their knickers at the stage. I've just sung Will of the People, and everybody's laughing at me. Oh, actually, they're the ones that noticed. The rest are just sort of ignoring me and shuffling out of the room. There's more people at the bar now than there are left in the audience. I'm giving you Will of the People, people. What more do you want? And then instead he can't do Get Brexit Done. Tends not really to talk about Brexit anymore because the man's not stupid. He knows the reality of the situation. It's Get Rwanda Done. I believe, and I'm relying on Ken in Folkestone, who I have no reason, Kev, I beg your pardon, in Folkestone, who I have no reason to mistrust, that Priti Patel may even have tweeted last week, Get Rwanda Done. What does that even mean? Get Rwanda done. Here's Rishi Sunak. Get Rwanda. Here's one. Hey, why is no one cheering for me? Why is no one throwing their knickers at the stage? And then finally, of course, you have the other. You have the other great example. You have the Will of the People, you have the Get Rwanda Done, and you have the Down with Foreign Courts. And that's not working either. So when Keir Starmer announces, as he has done today, that he is behind the National Trust, he is behind the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, I think he is saying, you can fight your culture wars. I'm going to stay sensible. How mad do you have to be to think that the National Trust displaying information about how the property you're visiting was built and paid for is a bad thing? You have to, mad's not fair, actually. You just have to be terrified of the truth because your whole notion of British superiority hinges upon the idea that it was skills and attributes, gifts and characteristics that saw us enjoy dominion over half the world. It wasn't, as it is with every single empire in history, a curious combination of bloodthirstiness, opportunism and greed. So that's why you don't want the information to be displayed in the houses that you're visiting, because you are embarrassed, ashamed, or even threatened on an identity level by the truth. Empire World by Satnam Sanghera, published this week, is an extraordinary book that you must buy. I know it's an odd thing to say because he will be powering up the non-fiction charts as I still hanging in there somehow after 12 weeks of publication, but buy Satnam's book this week. it's incredible. It puts him in the very highest echelons of modern historians, which for still a newspaper columnist is an incredible achievement. And he'll be joining us, I think, this week to talk a little more about that book, Empire World, a successor sequel to Empire Land. So I've got two questions for you. The one is a sort of coma question. How did the National Trust and the RNLI end up as targets in this country? And I'd like your answer to that question to be as complicated or as straightforward as you please. All right? How did the National Trust and the Royal National Lifeboat Institution end up as targets, political targets, being aimed at by the people who normally claim to love freedom of speech? I want you to explain that to someone who's just woken up. Imagine falling asleep in 2015 and waking up in 2024 to find out that the National Trust is public enemy number one for a certain type of right-winger. How did that happen? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. But the second bit, and this is a question in a sense designed to tempt people who don't normally ring in to talk to me. Do you like what this says about Keir Starmer? Keir Starmer is on the side of the National Trust. He is on the side of the RNLI. He is essentially seeking to diffuse the culture war cannons of troglodytes like 30p Lee and Jonathan Gullis. He says instead of working with the National Trust so more people can learn about and celebrate our culture and our history, they've managed to demean their work. In its desperation to cling on to power at all costs, the Tory party is trying to find woke agendas in the very civic institutions they once regarded with respect. This is a very important intervention. I wondered whether he'd completely ignore culture wars, but instead he is taking the fight to them and he is calling them idiots. And profoundly unpatriotic fools at that. Waging a war on the proud spirit of service in this country isn't leadership, it's desperate, it's divisive, it's damaging. It comes to something when the Tories are at war with the National Trust. So there are two questions for you here. Talk to me about what he describes about the Tory party trying to find woke agendas in the very civic institutions they once regarded with respect. As a Tory, what do you feel when you see your party attacking the National Trust or the Lifeboat Institution? And how do you account for it? How has it happened? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. And then we're going to be doing this a little bit more as the year unfolds or unravels. Time will tell. What do you think of this intervention from Starmer? What do you make of this? That's two things he's done now that I think are very important, and I do pay quite a lot of attention to these matters. What does he represent? I think oddly, and a lot of perhaps I say hard left, but I don't mean it in a rude way, aren't going to like this. I think Starmer is going to be quite a nostalgic politician. I think, and I don't know precisely which era it is that he will be seeking to emulate, but I think he is seeking to ally himself with a feeling that things used to be better, but not in the conservative way, which is you didn't used to hear foreign on trains and there were fewer brown faces in Sainsbury's. He means when we took pride in things, perhaps like the National Trust or the Royal National Lifeboat Institute, before Brexit, before that type of Tory just had to destroy things, had to promise to make people's life worse. The whole Rwanda plan is a promise. There's some people over here, they're foreign, we're going to make their life worse. Vote for us, we'll make their life worse. Welfare cuts. There's some people over here, they're poor. Vote for us, we'll make their life worse. So there's two types of nostalgia on offer, potentially, in the next general election. One is harking back to a mythical age when everybody was white and spoke like Mr. Chumley Warner. And the other is harking back to a very recent age where we were a decent society who sought or tried our best to reject the kind of bigotries of people like Nigel Farage. We kept them at arm's length. Even in 2014, the male quite rightly considered Farage to be too stinky for their support. But Starmer, I think, is reminding us of what it looks like, what a country can look like when it values things it's got, instead of moans and whines all the time about having to share them with foreigners or poor people or single mothers or people working from home or the woke. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. The two questions. Number one, how did the RNLI and the National Trust become targets for the Tory party? Talk me through it, even the stuff that you think that's obvious. And number two, do you welcome this? Would you rather Keir Starmer ignored the culture wars, or do you welcome the fact, and I'm surprised to find that I do, I thought he'd have been better served ignoring them, but actually he's moving his tanks onto the lawn, he's moving his tanks onto their lawn and pointing out that all of their weapons are made of balsa wood. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. I like this quite a lot. The more I talk about it, the more I like it, the more important I think it is. I suppose the dream caller, in a way, is that wavering Tory, that lonely Tory. Is this the kind of thing that can tempt you towards the Labour Party? Hit the numbers now, you will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 11 is the time. It took me 20 minutes to say what Paul says in a couple of sentences. The RNLI plucks people in trouble at sea out of the ocean. The National Trust sell you cake at posh houses that they look after. What a pair to go to war with. Who actually cares about woke? A rubbish rebranding of political correctness. And I think you're right, because the kind of people that don't want the RNLI to rescue people from the ocean because they are foreign people, or they're coming here in small dinghies, you want people to die because they're foreign. You don't want to be called racist, so you call yourself anti-woke. But for me, that is not a conservative value or even a Tory tradition. Telling the RNLI, who are mostly volunteers, who they should and shouldn't rescue from the sea, is quite extraordinarily fascistic. Well, you can rescue him. He's from Birmingham. You can't rescue him. He's from Baghdad. Let him drown, but rescue him. And of course, the kind of people doing that wouldn't. Could you imagine Nigel Farage on an RNLI boat actually trying to help people? To be fair, I'd struggle to imagine myself in that situation. But I'm talking about the physical strength that would be needed. But could you imagine Farage working as part of a team, dealing with the elements? The man starts phoning up Tory ministers when his bank account gets downgraded from Coots to NatWest. Could you imagine him dealing with that kind of scenario, risking his own life to help somebody else? And yet it's people like him that lead the line on attacks upon these British institutions. So, how do we feel about Keir Starmer pushing back? 22 after 11. John's in Brixton. John, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I mean, there's a mismatch between the volunteers and the management of these two organisations. I can only really speak about the National Trust.
From what perspective?
From the perspective of there are hundreds of thousands of people volunteering time and energy for free, because they passionately believe in maintaining these beautiful buildings and infrastructure that we can pass on for generations. And they feel that they are being managed by people who have not got the same aims as them.
That's what I meant by your perspective. With respect, mate, you can speak for yourself, but you can't speak for thousands of National Trust volunteers.
Hundreds of thousands of volunteers.
But you can only speak for you. Can only speak for you. You can't speak for them. I
can speak for my mother.
Yeah, go on then. Well, speak for your mother, but don't speak for hundreds of thousands of people.
My mother is a Labour supporter.
Right.
But she is increasingly frustrated with the mindsets of the management and the leaders.
What sort of things?
People are classic civil servants who don't have.
They're not. They don't work for the civil service. It's a charity. But what are the things that she objects to? Where does she volunteer? No, but she volunteers in a house in Surrey. I don't want to go into the absolute details. Why not?
She Look, it's not fair for me to. I don't think you would speak for your mother.
You were speaking for hundreds of thousands of volunteers 2 minutes ago.
But it's common knowledge.
So what's happened in that? What's happened in that house? What's happened in that house in Surrey that she's unhappy about?
It's a general.
I just want to. You know how it works, John. I like examples and evidence. So what's happened in that house in Surrey that's upset your mum?
Increasingly, they are bringing political doctrines into something.
For example,
it's not fair for me to speak on someone else's behalf.
Okay, an example from the entire National Trust then. Let's forget all about the house in which your mum definitely volunteers for the National Trust and talk. And I know she definitely does. In the unidentified, unnamed house where your unidentified, unnamed mother volunteers, it would be completely unfair to talk about specific examples because the unnamed, unidentified person in the unnamed, unidentified house would feel that they were having their sort of privacy compromised. So across the entire National Trust, what is the evidence, or what does your mum say, or indeed any of the other hundreds of thousands of volunteers you were claiming to speak for 2 minutes ago, what are they doing specifically that you think is objectionable?
She says, and she maintains that a lot of the other volunteers are frustrated by the mindset.
Yes, and what's the evidence of the mindset?
Their mindset is, you could identify as woke.
Yes, but examples, John. Examples
of they don't seem, rather than be appreciative of these beautiful architectural buildings and proud of their British virtues, they seem to be attacking.
How are they attacking them?
Because they, rather than rejoice in this great architecture we have, we spend our time attacking.
Well, it's not just about architecture, John. It's about the contents. It's about the exhibits. It's about the artwork that's on the walls. It's about the gardens. It's about the statuary. So just talk to me about the examples.
The people that contributed to make it happen.
I know, but you haven't given us a single example yet. You keep saying mindset, and I say, well, if it's an entire mindset, then it'll be easy to point to actual events, incidents, ideas. So give me one, just one.
We seem to be attacking the people that actually made these buildings happen.
Has someone pressed rewind on Global Player? Someone's pressed rewind on Global Player. I'm asking for examples. Give me an example of things being attacked.
The people who represent these buildings seem to be very interested in whether the money came from the slave trade.
Right. What's wrong with that?
Right. Now, at the end of the day, surely we should rather be rejoicing what they created.
You can do both.
And how it reflects on the positives.
How can you rejoice in the creation of something without understanding how it happened?
Well, this is it. Rather than rejoice and push the virtues of the architecture, they're more worried about, did every penny come from a genuine
where have you seen that? Which exhibit have you seen?
Increasingly, that's.
Well, go on, give me another example. Which house? Which house have you visited and you've seen an exhibit that you felt was putting too much emphasis?
I am speaking on behalf of my mother, who is a charity worker, and she gives her time for free.
Well, then she's not a charity worker, then, is she? She's not a charity worker. She's a volunteer. So where is the house? Where is the house that you feel, or your mum feels?
I'm prepared to say it's a property in Surrey, and it's a National Trust property.
Right, and across the entire trust, are we? It's 11:27 now. Are we going to have an entire conversation without you giving a single example of what you are?
Because I'm not a volunteer. I'm just trying to. I'm a Conservative. That's all.
Yes, but your mum's a Labour voter, remember? Or have you forgotten that bit of the story?
She's a Labour voter.
Right,
I'm a staunch Conservative.
Yeah, so your mum, the Labour voter, has got a problem with all the things you've just failed to describe.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. She has. Okay. Very much so.
And one example before you go?
Just the disconnect between the management and the staff. The way they treat the staff, and there's just a high-handed attitude.
You do know what volunteer means, don't you?
But yes, you're correct. Okay. But you still need to treat volunteers
So we're not talking about slavery anymore. We're talking about the high-handed attitude of the management.
The general mindset of the management.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
John, don't go, please. John?
I'm at work.
I want one example before you go. One house, one notice board, one exhibit.
I don't think it's fair for me to focus.
No, you did just for the benefit of people who are listening to this. I just want to make one thing clear. Hang on, John. I don't want to keep you from work for much longer. Can you just clarify for the benefit of people listening that you rang me today?
I rang you.
Yes, because a lot of people listening might think that I've somehow rung you and then taken you by surprise by asking you to contribute to the conversation that we're having with evidence and examples and insights, which you are clearly not prepared to give. But our very best from all of us to your mum, working so hard as a volunteer in that house in Surrey. Something about which I'm sure we can all agree. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
33 minutes after 11 is the time. So I think we can ever so slightly evolve the question now with respect to John and, of course, his mum, who's definitely a National Trust volunteer. Is that who it's aimed at? Is that all it ever was? People who don't want to know about the history of the houses that they're... No, it's not even that, is it? Because he hasn't been to any National Trust houses, or at least he hasn't been to anywhere the things that he's cross about are happening. So from the Tory point of view, this culture war that Keir Starmer has chosen to join this morning was about telling people who don't go to National Trust properties much that if they did, they would be finding out about how that property was funded and built, and that story would involve the slave trade. I mean, if that is all that we've got, it is actually quite an extraordinary reflection of what a mess we're in as a country, that had become such a big thing. I mean, we touched on it in passing. I made jokes about not wanting to know about the history of a place you were visiting. John talks about rejoicing in the architecture while being completely ignorant. Full stop. But in this case, while being completely ignorant about how the place was built. And what do you think the study of history is, if not cause and effect? Reasons and explanations. I don't want to study history. I don't want to know about how wars happened or who took part in them or how they... I just want to celebrate the majesty of battle. I mean, it is insane. But I've got a horrible feeling that's all there ever was. So the RNLI rescues thousands of people a year, some of whom are foreign, and the National Trust looks after hundreds of properties, some of which were built using money from the slave trade, and it, in all of its properties, seeks to educate visitors about the history of the house. I mean, is that it? How many Johns are there out there? 0345 6060 973. And if you've got one in your family, do you understand why the Tory parties have essentially, or the Tory party has essentially made him their target? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Hit those now, you will get through. 25 to 12. I need a little... I mean, if that's all there is, if that's all it ever was, then Keir Starmer's played a blinder. Essentially, Keir Starmer is appealing to everybody who doesn't hate history or think that the RNLI should let foreigners drown. And that is what the culture war was all along. I hate history because it's complicated, and I hate the RNLI because they don't let foreigners drown in the English Channel. Is that really all it ever was? Or do you think there might be more? Frank's in Broxbourne. Frank, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. It's what no one's cottoned on to, I think. It's polarisation. It works. This is just the latest target.
It's not. It doesn't work, though. It doesn't work, though, Frank.
It does, because Donald Trump in America, he's polarised the country. We got polarised here on Brexit. It does work,
I know
James.
that works. That Brexit work. You didn't hear my wonderful comedy routine about Rishi Sunak doing the greatest hits of Boris Johnson, but no one's singing. They're trying to They're trying to use... You heard the last caller. People who have got a genuine problem with the National Trust sound like blithering idiots.
But this is what I'm saying, that they just need examples. I mean, when Suella Braverman did a dog whistle, look at the idiots that turned up to protect the monuments.
Yes,
you know,
yes, but again, that's a tiny number of people. It's as if the culture war...
No, James, listen,
I'm listening.
There is Donald Trump famously, I think he said, be who you are. And he's emboldened people to be who they are. So... The people that maybe are racist, are homophobic, whatever, these people now are going around actually openly saying this, and we're 5 years behind America now. 4 years. They got Trump. We got Boris Johnson.
I'm much more optimistic. I'm much more optimistic than you. I think that what Starmer's done here is shine a light on how stupid this so-called culture war was. It's because
yes, perfect,
the other thing is
that's what he should have done. That's what everyone should have done this, but they're too scared to do it. Stand up against these people. Push back on them.
I don't know, mate. I mean, what you're looking at here, unless we're wrong, and unless there is more to it than people who don't like history. I'm here. People who don't like history because it's complicated, and people who don't like the RNLI because they won't let foreigners drown. You're looking at a post-Brexit Tory party that seems to have pinned absolutely everything on this, and then you throw Rwanda into the mix as well. And the only question you've got is, who the heck could even consider voting for these people? It's a truly extraordinary state of affairs. I think we've lost Frank. It's coming up to 11:39. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we're looking at Keir Starmer now. I want to get in on the Starmer angle rather than perhaps the question of what this so-called culture war really meant. I find these words, and you're entitled to laugh, but I find these words quite inspiring. Instead of working with the National Trust so more people can learn about and celebrate our culture and our history, they've managed to demean their work. In its desperation to cling on to power at all cost, the Tory party is trying to find woke agendas in the very civic institutions they once regarded with respect. And the double question now, politically now, because unless you've got an absolute humdinger of a contribution to make, I think offering up support for the Tories' perspective on the culture war really does involve attacking the RNLI for not leaving foreigners to drown, and attacking the National Trust for telling you the history of the house that you're visiting. I mean, the twin question is, how on earth did the Tories end up in this place? And how do you feel about Keir Starmer taking it on? This, to me, is quite a moment in the so-called election campaign, in this endless run towards the next election campaign. Keir Starmer essentially saying, I will fight your culture war, but I will fight it by showing everybody how stupid it is. And then you and me being left here thinking, how on earth did the Tories end up in a place where the National Trust and the Royal National Lifeboat Institution were being offered up to the voting public as targets for anger and disapproval? Listen, you can have a degree of consensus on this. There can be a sense that the answers are kind of obvious, but I want to know how it's happened. Tina says, your caller John was an example of an individual who only believes what the Daily Mail tells them with no real-life examples. Well, to be fair, on this one, it's more the Daily Telegraph than the Daily Mail. Ben in Devon says, the first thing I do when I go into a big house is think, I wonder how they paid for this. It seems you're not allowed to tell the truth now. I'm the same, actually. I think it's completely fascinating. And the war on woke, writes Anthony, is a busted flush that plays well with the right-wing press, but falls down in the real world. Ron DeSantis would be a very good case in point. His entire campaign to become the Republican nominee was built on the war on woke, and look where that got him. Even Trump has realised it's over and reined in the culture war rhetoric during his rally in New Hampshire this weekend. I mean, there it is. You knit those two politicians together, those two incredibly different politicians, and the busted flush that the whole war on woke always appeared to be becomes, I think, undeniable. Ron DeSantis, seeking the Republican nomination to fight for the American presidency, built his entire campaign on being anti-woke without ever really being able to prove what it means or explain what it means. And Keir Starmer, a traditionally very cautious politician, now seeing electoral advantage because, listen, he's a politician. Everything is about electoral advantage in some ways, especially in an election year. He sees electoral advantage now in going after things that the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph are telling their readers are really big and important problems. I think, actually, that's a brilliant contribution from Tony in Walthamstow. This combination of stories, Ron DeSantis plus Starmer defending the National Trust, actually does open the door to wondering whether the entire notion of culture wars and wokeness is now withering on the vine. you kind of have to hope so. Neil's in Guildford. Neil, what made you pick up the phone?
I think I'm just like yourself. I'm just tired every other week. They're picking on something else to distract people from what's important.
But it's not working.
Yeah, well, it isn't, but they think it is. They think if they just keep hitting often enough, but all they're doing is appealing to their own little voters and their echo chamber. It's not going to get new votes, is it?
I don't see how, not now. I think maybe people didn't realise, the less you think about it, the more effective it is. I can't believe it. This unidentified enemy is attacking the National Trust now, undermining the National Trust. But as soon as you ask for proof or evidence, the whole project looks completely ridiculous.
Well, next time I go to National Trust, I'll keep my eye open for the enemy. I'll be very aware. You know, I'll look behind the paintings or something. I mean, it's just that they can't talk about the economy. They've run out of steam.
True.
Brexit's a disaster. They can't really talk about that.
True.
They can't talk about the NHS because the waiting list, there's only so much you can blame a striking doctor.
Yeah, although he had another go at that last week, didn't he? They
did. And again, it only appears you've run out of ideas. There's only so long you can blame drowning migrants before you think, well, we all know Rwanda's it's a disaster waiting to happen, because even if it does take off, you know what these countries are like. It'll be some prison guard or someone will do something silly and it'll all blow up and it'll be an expensive waste of our money again. And it's just they've run out of ideas.
So but I guess this is partly of the Rwanda policy as well. They are literally appealing to UKIP voters. That's all that's left. People who don't really understand much but who hate anything that feels either 21st century or foreign.
Basically, yeah. I think what's happened is there's a war within their own party. There's your moderate conservatives, there's your extreme right who are going off with this other crazy...
And this is them. This is their work. This is very much their territory. And this is them
fighting each other. Yeah, we all know the real battle for the Tories the next election. They know they're not going to win it, but there might be the battle of, well, OK...
Which makes it an even more it makes it an even more interesting intervention from Starmer, because literally, and I think you might be right, these are the only fronts upon which they feel they can fight. I think 30p Lee kind of said so out loud, didn't he? He said we can't go into the election on any of the platforms that we fought the last one on. All we'll have is the culture wars, and Starmer's now coming for that as well. Do you know what? I think Neil's nailed it. All the things he listed that the Tories can't campaign on because they've fluffed it up. All they're left with is the sort of notional, nebulous culture war battles. We will protect you from the hooded claw, keep the vampire from your door. Just don't ask us what the vampires look like or to identify the hooded claw. And then you have this extraordinary situation where anybody who's fallen for the rhetoric falls apart the moment they're asked to provide some proof. Just give me an example of what you're talking about. And they'll come out and say, well, if they even had an example, it would be something like, well, there's an exhibit at Harewood House in Yorkshire, which isn't even a National Trust property, I don't think. The Earl of Harewood still owns it. But it's all about how the slave trade enabled his ancestors to build the house. There's even a wonderful portrait of the actor David Harewood there, who is named Harewood because his ancestors would have been owned by the Earl of Harewood's ancestors. How can that not be fascinating, not be interesting? Listen, I hesitate to say this, but I don't think that the so-called culture war, every single person that might be drawn to it or to whom it might appeal is, when push comes to shove, whether they went to Eton College or the local comprehensive school, they're all going to sound like John in Brixton, aren't they? When you actually ask them to put some flesh upon the bones of their bigotries.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:49 and it's, listen, it's quite an interesting morning this. Two stories on the front page of the Times, which it took Tony in Wolverhampton, even though I've got it staring at me, to knit them together. Starmer defends National Trust against Tory claims of wokery. DeSantis quits Republican race and backs Trump. I think they are both, actually, consequences of the fact that nobody could ever describe what woke meant without ultimately saying something like, well, I don't think we should learn about slavery, or I don't think the RNLI should rescue foreign people from the English Channel. And that's the problem with using it as a culture war. Some people do feel that way. They even sometimes ring me. But you can't mount an election campaign on things that you're not allowed to say out loud. The Rwanda policy is built to appeal to people who wish that the RNLI would stop rescuing foreign people from the Channel, isn't it? The Rwanda campaign is built on appealing to people who hate the idea of, they don't really go to National Trust houses, but they hate the idea of National Trust houses containing information about how those houses were paid for. It's politics built upon the support of profoundly stupid, ugly people. And that's why it's so interesting that DeSantis has failed so horribly, and Starmer now feels emboldened to effectively say so, although he's much more polite and mature than me, so he wouldn't use language like that. Instead, he simply says, waging a war on the proud spirit of service in this country isn't leadership. It's desperate, it's divisive, it's damaging. It comes to something when the Tories are at war with the National Trust. There is room for you to tell me why the depiction of the so-called culture war as a belief that the National Trust shouldn't do history and the RNLI shouldn't rescue foreigners is unfair. But I've got to tell you, I think you'll struggle to prove it. What else is there? What else are these people objecting to? 0345 60 60 973. Vince is in Basildon. Vince, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Welcome aboard.
Thank you very much. I went to Barbados, and I went to St. Nicholas's Priory. And when we arrived there, we were met by a young Bayesian woman, and she said, this place was built on the back of slavery. We've got over it, now you need to get over it. And I'm a member of the National Trust. I'm also a member of English Heritage, and I also do work with my church as a charity. And I think what Keir Starmer has recognised is that it's a bit like the Army versus MacArthur, when effectively you pull down the facade of the lies and the deception and the distraction. When you pull those down, you've then demonstrated is that there's nothing left for you to see. And I think your last caller, I listened to the last caller, I thought absolutely 100% that was exactly the view that I had, is that Starmer has taken this on now, because effectively is that he's now going to have to make them fight on some other ground if he can actually pull this rug from under them.
Yes, that's really good, actually. And I don't think it's opportunistic. I think he obviously, he does mean what he says, and the reason he hasn't come out and said it sooner is because there wasn't really much point, was there?
No, I don't think there was, and I think that, Keir Starmer strikes me as someone who's very, very cautious in the way in which he approaches politics, and to some extent, my only criticism of it is sometimes he's too cautious. But I do think is on this occasion it's absolutely right to draw this to attention. I mean, my God, what kind of country have we become when effectively is that you can't go to a stately home? We all know how they were built. We all know.
Well, I think you do, but actually I don't think most of us do. I didn't realise the full extent of it. Pretty much every fortune, particularly the ones that are still in play today, can be traced back either to the slave trade or the Norman conquest.
Indeed, I mean, and also the family names that you see, the Norman names that still exist. We have MPs whose fortunes were built on slavery, who are probably the most outspoken on social policies of trying to help the poor. I mean, it is just simply breathtaking. I mean, I originally come from West Cumbria, the Lake District.
Yes.
I had the fortune of being supported by my trade union to go to Ruskin College. I then did a law degree and then qualified as a barrister. So I'm in the fortunate position to have crossed over to the other side, if you put it that way. But to some extent, that hasn't clouded my view as to what the real reality is of where people are because of the charity work which I do locally here. And I just find myself enraged, really, by the distraction that goes on. And the front pages of the paper, you just read them out, the front pages of the paper, which distort the colour for the entire day as to what the topic is. It is unbelievable, and I'm really pleased that Starmer's done what he's done.
Well, I'm a bit annoyed. Because I've got a job to do here, Vince. I mean this, actually. The more this conversation goes on, the more I think there's nothing here. I can't believe... it's as if the Tories have pushed all their chips into the middle of the table and there's just a big hole there. They've just fallen through a hole in the table. There's no battle here. There's no fight. You can talk to people like John until you're blue in the face. But, people with no evidence and no examples to back up the prejudices they already had. I'm not going to get 6 months of phone-ins out of this.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, James.
Thank you, Vince. I feel seen.
But the good news is I bought your book, so that will help you get through for a little bit longer.
I'm hanging on by my feet. What if there? Can I do a phone in on this later in the week? What if there never was a culture war? There are days when I know I'm a victim of what Vince has just described, because I'm a seagull, not a trawler most days. We follow the boats. All of this stuff about the National Trust, all of this stuff about the RNLI, where did the antipathy towards the RNLI come from? Bloody Farage again. Maybe there's nothing here. Maybe there never was a culture war. Keir Starmer has not so much picked a fight as walked into an empty room and owned it. I don't know. Liz is in Wimbledon. Liz, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
Very well. What's on your mind?
I'm just a bit concerned that the tone of this conversation is over-jovial, over-optimistic. I think that what Starmer has said is great. I applaud it. It's about time somebody calls the culture war out for what it is. But there's so much more going on connected to it than National Trust properties.
Well, we've gone in quite hard on the Rwanda plan, to be fair, which is both sinister and grim and profoundly unpleasant. But you're right. I mean, one thinks of Suella Braverman and Robert Jenrick latterly, Kemi Badenoch. These people are embarked upon a very, very ugly course. But if it's built upon this road, I think it is a time perhaps for some mild optimism. It looks as if, and Ron DeSantis in America, Liz, it looks as if that they're struggling to find any legs to stand on.
I don't agree.
Go on.
I think that what was, I don't know if it was announced, I think it was more leaked last week. The suggestion from Kemi Badenoch and Esther McVeigh that diversity training would have to take place outside work hours. I think that's insidious.
I think that's
really
leadership.
Dangerous.
I think that's leadership battles rather than necessarily national politics. I think that's them. In fact, I take your point. No one's underestimating the seriousness of what some of these people are embarked upon. But in fact, they're all arguing over the same comb. They're all arguing for the same base. They're all going after people who would be impressed by that. And, I've had those calls as well. You've probably heard them. Someone complaining about diversity training and me asking them what it was and what happened in these classes. And him ending up saying something like, well, it just encouraged us not to be prejudiced, or it encouraged us to be a bit more open-minded, or it encouraged us to be mindful of other people's problems and other people's privileges and our own privileges. All of these things that they set up as terrible enemies, terrible targets to be attacked, turn out, as Ron DeSantis has just discovered, to be ineffective electorally because they don't really exist. But I'd rather be optimistic than pessimistic, but not unduly so. And last word on this to Jules, who's in Swindon. Jules, what if the culture war never was?
Well, I don't know that it never was, but hello, good morning, by the way.
Hello,
I just wonder whether it's just asymmetric warfare, is that there's just this little camp of people who are railing against the entire world. It's just, there's nothing to fight against. I was talking to a researcher about Snow's Hill House, which is a National Trust property in Gloucestershire, which I don't know if you've ever been. It doesn't make sense unless you know that the man who built the collection of, there's a room full of samurai armour in Gloucestershire rural country house. And it doesn't make sense unless you realise, well, the money came from sugar plantations.
Yeah.
So not only is it like the idle rich going around basically collecting tat from around the world, high quality tat, expensive tat, but still tat. But also the family ethos was we can go anywhere in the world and exploit anything for whatever
and
we
help
want
ourselves.
On a whim.
Now, I don't feel any sense of personal guilt or shame about that. Why do you think a certain type of Brit does? Why would you feel? I mean, unless it was your own family and you felt perhaps you had some responsibility to atone or even make some form of reparation to the areas that you had exploited or stolen from. Why would John in Brixton feel a personal sense of wanting to keep it secret? I
have no idea. I don't know, other than perhaps, a secret urge that if they had that kind of money, they would want to do something similar? Maybe, I don't know.
No, we're veering into amateur psychology, which is my favourite kind. But that is often it, that idea that I'd like a really unfair society, even though I'm on the wrong side of it, because one day I might be on the right side of it, and I'd hate it if I had to behave fairly. Jules, taking me a little bit beyond the 12 o'clock news.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. In for a penny, in for a pound, eh? The chief rabbi has said that using the word genocide to describe Israel's actions in Gaza is, in his words, an increasingly frequent, disingenuous misappropriation of the term. He describes it as a moral inversion which undermines the memory of the worst crimes in human history and was designed to tear open the still gaping wound of the Holocaust. This follows testimony in The Hague at the International Court of Justice, claiming that Israel had shown chilling and incontrovertible intent to commit genocide in Gaza. South Africa brought the case, and South Africa alleged grave violence and genocidal acts. Israel has described the case as baseless and accused South Africa of presenting a profoundly distorted view of hostilities, barely distinguishable from that of Hamas. Sir Ephraim Mervis, the chief rabbi, took to the pages of the Sunday Telegraph yesterday. He was, interestingly, born and educated in South Africa, and he argued that Israel was not intent on the purposeful annihilation of a people as an objective in and of itself. He said it should be obvious that if Israel's objectives were genocidal, it could have used its military strength to level Gaza in a matter of days. And I want to know what you think. That, to me, is quite a grim defence. I think the death toll passed 25,000 this weekend. The what's the word for when you get moved? Displacement is in the millions. The destruction of property, if you like, homes, hospitals, schools, and the rest of it is apocalyptic now. And yet only about 1% of Gaza's population has been killed. Netanyahu has said he won't stop. Netanyahu has said not only that he won't stop, but also that the two-state solution is not something that he subscribes to. That has finally prompted responses from British politicians, quite a robust, albeit belated response for many from Keir Starmer, and a fairly mealy-mouthed objection with words and no actions from Grant Shapps. But there are two elements of what the chief rabbi has said that I think are worthy of further exploration, further conversation. The first is the idea that you can't call this... So some people have got a problem with the word massacre. I mean, it's a funny one, isn't it? What word are you allowed to use to describe the killing of 25,000 people, the enormous majority of whom are civilians? You could say war, but that at least presumes on some level a balance in conflict. In war, you normally, not perhaps always, but you normally have rising death tolls on both sides that bear some resemblance to each other. So I don't like war. I mean, the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, whether you've told people to get out of there or not, is a pre-Geneva Convention war, but not post-Geneva Convention war. But I find this bit very powerful. So I find that defence very weak. It's not a genocide because we've only killed 25,000. And if we really wanted to eradicate everybody, we would have done by now. Number one, the international community would not have put up with that. And number two, I think for everybody, whether you were supportive of Netanyahu at the beginning or not, for everybody, the incremental nature of the escalation has been terrifying. You know, to go from, as I have, from saying Israel has every right to respond very, very robustly to this disgusting terrorist atrocity on October the 7th, to go within a fortnight to say, whoa, I've got a horrible feeling they're never going to stop. And no one can be in favour of, well, obviously some people are in favour of that, but lots and lots of people used words like proportionate. And that went out the window some time ago. 25,000 dead already, and that's the ones we know about. So I find that very weak. I think semantically, and we're probably going to have to do some semantics today, semantically I'm not sure that genocide is the right word to use, but the case that South Africa have brought to the International Court of Justice in The Hague it's certainly not baseless, as Israel have described. Let's just call it interesting and deeply troubling and hurtful, whatever your perspective on this may be. But the other bit I find very powerful, oddly. So I find half of the chief rabbi's objection oddly weak. I mean, imagine a genocide that is 3 months old, and the defense of the perpetrators is, well, you can't call it a genocide because it's only just started. That's why I find it weak. I'm not saying that is what is happening here, or that is what the rabbi is saying, but you don't press the nuclear button on day one, do you? I'm using nuclear metaphorically there. But the reason I don't like the word genocide in this context, and the reason why I find this part of his analysis very strong, is that I think it is designed to tear open the still gaping wound of the Holocaust by some people. I think there is a deliberate attempt to accuse Israel of behaving like the Nazi persecutors of the Jews. In fact, I don't even have to say I think that. I've seen it. And that is part of the reason why the word genocide is so resonant and so horrible in this context. But is that in and of itself a reason why it shouldn't be used in good faith? I don't think that the South African case in the International Court of Justice is designed to portray Israel as somehow being akin to the Nazis who undertook the Holocaust. Everything I say here, you are welcome to disagree with. In fact, it's quite important. I really don't think that South Africa have brought this case in order to deliberately foment the idea that Israel's conduct is in any way morally or militarily comparable to the conduct of the Nazis in the Second World War. So to tell them that they can't use the word because it tears open the still gaping wound of the Holocaust seems to me to be, can I go as far as to say unfair? So why are people... Well, let me tell you what the definition is. I mean, there's dictionary definitions and legal definitions. So the dictionary definition is the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. Right? The legal definition is Article 2 of the Geneva Convention. It's a crime committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial or religious group in whole or in part. It doesn't include political groups or so-called cultural genocide. So cultural genocide is when you would restrict access to churches or books, or you just try and kill an idea, you kill a sense of self, a sort of form of cultural genocide in some of the former Soviet republics when they keep insisting that they're Russian. But genocide itself is either, for the dictionary, and they're very similar, these, the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group, or, according to the Geneva Convention, Article 2 describes it as a crime committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial or religious group, or in whole or in part. So, when would the word be applicable then, in that case? As the chief rabbi says, it's not applicable now because Israel has only killed 1% of the Palestinian population. And if we really wanted to, this is his argument, not mine, if we really wanted to, If Israel really wanted to, it could have used its military strength to level Gaza in a matter of days. I'm giving you quite a complicated introduction, but I'm not asking you complicated questions. Essentially, I'm asking you for your take on this. There's two things going on here. There are two uses or definitions of the word genocide. One of them is literal and semantic, and that's a debate to be had. One of them is historical and philosophical, and that's a question of whether or not that word should ever be used in the context of Jewishness. And I don't know the answer to the second question. My instincts are you should never accuse Israel of genocide, even if the death toll had reached 100,000 or 200,000 or 300,000. But that's my instincts, not my intellect. My instincts say he's right. It does tear open the still gaping wound of the Holocaust. But that doesn't, if the figure were to reach 100,000 or 200,000, the Holocaust doesn't have any role to play in the 21st definition of what's happening in Gaza, does it? You see why I find this complicated? You see why these two positions that he's adopted have such a tension between them? It can't be a genocide because if it was, it would be over by now. That's what the chief rabbi has said. Words to that effect. That's not even a précis or a translation. And then the other argument being you shouldn't use that word because it conjures up memories of the Holocaust. Your thoughts? 03456060973. Just to be clear on the numbers, 25,000 dead now, known to be dead, as many people tell me who've worked in disaster relief and war zones. When the rubble is sifted through, that number will rise exponentially. But that's about 1% of Gaza's population. Tens of thousands of buildings have been destroyed since that 7th of October attack, and those attacks killed about 1,200 people. 240 people taken hostage. Evidence has emerged of war crimes, the systematic use of rape and sexual violence in the attacks. They are stone-cold war crimes. Last week, Human Rights Watch said the Israeli government was using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare in Gaza. Amnesty International has pointed to airstrikes on a Greek Orthodox church where 18 civilians were sheltering, and to attacks on a refugee camp where 28 civilians were killed. And they cite these, this is Amnesty International, they cite these as examples of mass killing. 60 minutes after 12 is the time. And then the other argument from the chief rabbi is that the war would end tomorrow if Hamas released Israel's hostages and laid down its weapons. And that is a reason why you shouldn't call it genocide. I don't quite understand that, especially after Netanyahu has made it clear that even if Hamas were to do that, the people on the Gaza Strip would be living under Israeli security control. Indeed, there would be Israeli security control from the River Jordan all the way to the sea. I could give him his full credit, I suppose, if that's the right word to use. He said, no decent person could be unmoved by the tragic suffering of innocent Palestinians. But if there is indeed a genocidal force in this conflict, it must surely be Hamas. I don't quite think it's helpful for him to think he can use the word to describe the disgusting murder of 1,200 people, but the people using it to question the killing of 25,000 should not do so because of the Holocaust. I think I've handled that fairly sensitively. There will no doubt be plenty of people who think that I haven't, but I can live with that. I have to live with that if I want you to have the opportunity to have these types of conversations. And I think it's important that we do. The phone lines are open.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 20 minutes after 12 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It's not about numbers, James, says Lisa. It's about design. You're tying yourself in knots. I think on the basis of numbers alone, you want to claim it's genocide. That's a fundamental sleight of hand. Crikey, I read the first two lines of that message, Lisa, and thought that you were going to accuse me of the opposite, that I was to tie myself in knots to deny that it's a genocide, because an awful lot of people getting in touch with the programme think that it obviously is. And that is why I tie myself in knots. I don't know. I don't think it is at the moment, but I find the defence that we've only killed 1% of the population, and if we'd really wanted to, we could have killed 90. I just find it a bit blood-curdling, actually. And to be clear, I don't think the word applies. And I wonder why so many people are so keen to prove that it should, or to believe that it should. Proof and belief are two very different things. I don't know enough about the South African context, but I think Israel historically was a great ally of apartheid, and so there's beef, there's historical beef here, for want of a more profound word. But it seems to me that there is ethnic cleansing going on, but there is not genocide. And I don't quite understand the hunger in some quarters for that word to apply. 22 after 12 is the time. Jake's in Brighton. Jake, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. Thanks for having me on the show. I just wanted to first of all say that I agree with most of what you say. And I think you do a very good job. I don't believe it can be called genocide by any means. The Israeli government, the IDF, haven't shown any intent to commit genocide. I think the word is bandied around. I think it was bandied around before even the 7th of October by the loony left, who like to dirty the waters and object to the whole existence of Israel.
Let's focus on what is in play. Now, I mean, I don't know that words like loony left are helpful. If you were to do the full death toll of Palestinian people over the last 10 years or the last 20 years, it would be a big shock to many people who rely on the British media for their information. But we know what the death toll is since October the 7th. It's 25,000 people. Is there any case for wondering, and I think that the Chief Rabbi has left the door open to this question, how many people would have to be dead before that word became relevant for you?
I think the death of any individual, any civilian or military person, is very regrettable and awful. But I don't think the number of people dying can be attributed to genocide. I think,
Ever?
There's a very... No, I don't believe
But what if
so,
there was
because...
nobody left in Gaza? What would you call it then?
Well, if a group of people were attacking my family, I would keep going until they stopped. It didn't matter how big that group is, whether it's 10 people or 10 million.
But if that group is a national, ethnic or racial or religious group, then under the definition of the Geneva Convention, wiping them all out is a genocide.
No, the intent to get rid of that
but you're conflating Hamas with Palestinian civilians.
Yeah, but
That's terrible. You just did it so casually.
But one of the reasons is...
No, Jake, we have to stop. Jake, we have to stop here.
Yeah.
The justification for killing Palestinian children is not the actions of Hamas.
But they're not intending to kill children. That's the whole thing. It's the intent.
Well, they're not very good at it then, are they? Because they've killed 12,000.
Well, one of the reasons we know is because Hamas are hiding in hospitals and they're hiding behind people. And so... The IDF, when they drop a bomb on a hospital, So
the punishment for being held hostage by Hamas is to be killed by Israel? Or rather, the reward, perhaps? I'm very struck by what you just did.
No, but it's incidental.
I think we both are. Well, it's not incidental, is it? Because the bombs are aimed and fired.
Yeah, but they're not intending to kill civilians. That's a very
What are they expecting to happen?
Well, they're hoping that the area will vacate and then they can bomb wherever they need to bomb and
based on what?
They've got to limit the amount of deaths, and they're trying to limit the amount of
But
deaths.
It's 25,000.
I think it's wrong to accuse them of maximising or trying to maximise deaths when we know that they're not.
Which is why I wondered whether there was a number at which point the word genocide would become relevant, and that's when I would hope, perhaps...
I think the word incidental...
Hang on, I haven't finished.
Yeah, sorry.
That's when I would hope accidentally, that's when you used the atrocities of Hamas to justify the killing of every single Palestinian in Gaza.
But there's precautions, so what you're suggesting is that the IDF don't take precautions.
No, I'm going to insist that we focus on the point that's popped up in the course of this conversation, and you're welcome to resile from what you said, but you did state that the prospect of every single person in Gaza being killed...
I don't think there is a number.
Oh, you're interrupting me again. You did state on the radio that the prospect of every single person in Gaza being killed was something you could accommodate on the grounds that they were pursuing the group that had attacked on October the 7th.
I don't think they should pursue any death, and I don't think they should pursue...
No, you do, because they are. So, again, listen, I appreciate the difficulties that you're having, and I mean that in a nice way.
Yeah.
But there has to be a point at which it becomes potentially genocidal, doesn't it?
Okay, well, let me... do you suggest...
I don't have to suggest anything. I'm here to ask questions.
Okay. It sounds to me like you're suggesting that they should pull out or desist. I don't think they should desist. I think this is a very different situation.
Then we come back to the how many dead is too many, don't we, Jake?
Well... You can't put a number. This war has to be won, and you keep using the word proportional. I don't believe...
No, I stopped using that 2 weeks ago. It stopped being proportional 2 weeks ago.
Well, I believe that they should fight this war until Hamas surrender. And that's the way most wars have been won in the past. You look at the terrible number of people that died in the First World War and Second World War.
Hamas aren't an army, they're a terrorist group, and no other wars have been fought between an army and a terrorist group.
They're the government of Gaza.
But they're a terrorist group. They're a prescribed terrorist group who put their own civilians more at risk even than the Israelis do. So I'm just trying to think. I want you to try and imagine it from the Palestinian civilians' point of view.
Oh, absolutely, and
because you've already said they deserve to die because of the actions of Hamas.
They deserve to die. You put that word in my mouth.
Well,
my heart is with the Palestinian people. I feel terribly sorry for them,
but until Hamas surrender, it's just bad luck.
It's war. It is war, and war is terrible. Though, is it? And this war has to be fought until Hamas defeated or surrender.
And if that involves killing everyone in Gaza, that's genocide.
I don't believe IDF will kill it.
Well, fingers crossed, Jake. No, fingers crossed, eh? I mean, I don't either, but then again, I didn't believe they'd killed 25,000 people a couple of months ago, and here we are, 20 coming up to 29 minutes after 12 is the time. I think you should be able to use whatever words you want pretty much to describe whatever you want, but this is not a conversation about freedom of speech. This is a conversation about accuracy and fairness. And despite I found some pretty grim elements of what Jake just said. I do agree with him. I don't think genocide is the right word to use in this context. I do think ethnic cleansing is, and I am increasingly impatient with the idea that 1.2 million people are all somehow responsible for the actions of Hamas and therefore are fair game in the context of war. It's not a war in any conventional sense because it is being conducted between an army and a guerrilla group of terrorists, disgusting, murderous, death cult terrorists, but they're not fighting on behalf of the people they profess to be fighting for, while the Israeli army is. It just doesn't fit the traditional parameters, the ethical or historical parameters of war. But I think you'd have to believe that it did if you were supportive, however reluctantly, of what's currently going on. It's 12:30 is the time. Amelia Cox is here with the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:34 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A couple of texts to set the context. Cisse writes, the problem with your stance, James, is that, like the rabbi, you are almost saying that Israel's actions cannot be classed as genocide. I guess the question for you, then, is what will Israel need to do for it to be called genocide? Will they have to tell us that they will wipe out the whole of Palestine? Because I thought the ambassador had already told us that. I'm not sure she did. I mean, they've both now, Netanyahu and the Israeli ambassador to London, have both ruled out the two-state solution. I don't think she quite called for the whole of Gaza to be wiped out. But Sarah takes up a counterpoint. To exclude Israel from being labelled as genocidal means you can't use it for anything other than the Holocaust, ? I think that's what's being argued. However, we have the Rwandan genocide, we have the genocide of Soviet prisoners of war, Cambodian genocide, etc. It's all or nothing for me, I'm afraid. It's either applicable to many acts or it isn't. Yeah, but it still has to be accurate. I mean, the rabbi's point is twofold. It's number one, that there is a deliberate attempt to use the word to tear open the still gaping wound of the Holocaust. But number two is, and it isn't a genocide anyway. So it's not quite as you describe it. And picking up on the first caller, I do have sympathy with Jake, although I don't agree with them, because it's a necessary cognitive dissonance to hang on to your humanity. Supporting warfare while being convinced that civilian deaths are somehow less of an issue because they're, quotes, not intentional, end quotes, feels like the mind trying to do just enough gymnastics so that you don't feel like you're effectively calling for people to die by trying to create that distinction. It is tough. And Pat in Sutton, like a lot of people, points out that the IRA was also a terrorist group and who blew up innocent women and children, and they never surrendered. It is 12:36. Arfana is in Reading. Arfana, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Hi. So, I mean, there's this whole issue around text and subtext. And I think one of your text messages actually was hinting to that about, do they actually have to state it clearly for us to then say, yes, it's genocide?
Well, that would be genocidal intent, wouldn't it? It's
genocidal intent, yes. I mean, the thing is that genocidal intent, so what evidence do we have to state that we think it is genocidal intent?
Yeah.
And I think the South African case clearly laid it out with the numerous statements that were made by the ministers in the Israeli cabinet, by the actual actions, by very little evidence provided by Israel as to why those actions took place, why they bombed hospitals, why they bombed refugee camps. And the other thing about the genocidal intent is that, just like you've just read out with one of the messages, is it only applicable to the Holocaust? And if we look at the history and if we look at how the Holocaust took place, it wasn't really stated openly that they were out to kill all the Jews. I know it was later on, but it was a whole process, the process of dehumanizing Jewish people, the whole process of, of stating that, the tropes that are out about, the Jewish people. And when all of that took place, the gas chambers and all that horrendous action then took place. And that was over, a number of years.
I understand the point you're making, and you're being very, very sensitive. That is why the second bit of what the rabbi said troubled me slightly. The idea you can't call it that because if we wanted to do that, we'd have done it in 10 minutes. We'd have done. I mean, you're talking about, when we use the phrase intent, you're talking about direction of traffic. And as they've heard there's an odd legal distinction between whether or not the international court finds it pertinent. Only time will tell. But some of the Israeli politicians coming out with what I think does qualify as genocidal intent are not members of the war cabinet. So you've got an agriculture minister, for example. And then you've got another politician calling for a nuclear bomb to be used. But the defence Israel would offer up is that they're not members of the war cabinet. Therefore, making suggestions like flattening Gaza with a nuclear bomb can't be really described as policy, because it isn't. It's a particular personal position held by a pungent politician.
Yeah, but the thing is that, okay, it's not
because
policy,
it dehumanises.
But when yes, it does dehumanise. And then when you look at what then just like what you said earlier, there's a philosophical argument in this,
yes,
and then there's a legal argument.
Yes,
and I think that it's getting to a point where the philosophical messages in Israel are being intertwined with the actions that are taking place there.
Yeah, okay. So that the actions are catching up with the rhetoric, which in November 2023, everybody found repellent and people were quick to disown the numbers as they rise. Well, that's the problem, isn't it? It's a crass question, which I think I managed to ask in quite a sensitive fashion. It began as how much is too much, how many deaths would be too many deaths in a probably vain pursuit of the eradication of Hamas or the release of hostages. And now, in a way, we're asking ourselves months later, the same question with different words, which is how many Palestinians would Israel have to kill before the word genocide became acceptable for you? And for some people, they've already passed that threshold. And part of the reason for that is the dehumanizing. If you go back to November of 2023, when a director of UCLA's YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies said in a phone interview with NBC News that some of the rhetoric being used by some of the politicians we've just referred to could be seen as potentially genocidal from the way that it dehumanizes Palestinian civilians. That was Dov Waxman speaking in November 2023. And Alfana makes the point that the rhetoric that seemed extreme then has moved closer to the mainstream since, with comments from the Israeli ambassador to London and the Israeli Prime Minister himself moving closer to people like Avi Dichter and others and Smotrich as well, moving closer to them than to, I don't know, the opposite side, whatever that is. 12:41 is the time, as is in Forest Hill. Az, what would you like to say?
How you doing?
Good, mate. What's on your mind?
I was listening to I found out the previous caller, the gentleman before.
Yes.
Denying that the genocide is a good word to use, and if people look historically at groups of people who have been, and I use the word that Dr. Gerald Horne uses. Dr. Gerald Horne teaches at the University of Houston, history of African American studies. He uses the word liquidation or extermination. And in his book on Texas, the counter-revolution of 1836,
yes,
on page 26, he lists about 30 to 40 indigenous people who have been exterminated.
Tribes, you mean? Indigenous peoples, plural.
Indigenous peoples, and I can't pronounce some of these names because I've never seen them before.
Sure.
So the question then becomes, how many of the people of that particular group do you then say to the rest of the world, we should pause here because, we're looking at a potential extermination? Because in my book, I just put Palestinians with a question mark. Because at some point, we're just going to look back in 50 years' time and say, there was this group of people called Palestinians, and we didn't do anything. And we're all sitting here, let's have another meeting.
I think
that's my opinion.
And it's a powerful opinion, very well expressed. And I think that some of the people I've spoken to over the last few months probably don't realise that if that were to happen, then they would be left saying, well, Hamas should have surrendered.
And then the point you just made about the IRA not surrendering, at what point do people fighting for their self-determination should you say enough is enough?
So if 2.3 million people died, would these people still say Hamas should have surrendered? It's all on them. I think they would.
I mean, they've got themselves into they're never going to defeat Hamas. And I'm only saying that because I've got so many history books, and I read specifically Sir Anthony Beevor's book on Stalingrad,
yes,
where the whole Stalingrad was razed to the ground, and then the Wehrmacht, the Sixth Army of the Nazi Germany, they marched in thinking that they could defeat the Russians.
Yeah.
I mean, they couldn't, and that's the position that they're going to find themselves in. So, at what point can you defeat an ideology? You cannot.
I think the Tamils were defeated. I don't know whether you've read up on that. You sound much more scholarly and informed than I am on a lot of these issues. Or certainly better read. But I think if you needed to find an example from relatively recent history of an ideology being eradicated, to use the word that your professor uses, I think the case of the Tamils in Sri Lanka comes pretty close. So, and no one's suggesting this is Israel's intent. If you were to kill everybody who might even think of signing up to your enemy, in this case Hamas, then that would be success, regardless of how many people.
So that means that every Palestinian should be killed. And as you said, when you spoke to the Nigerian lawyer, I think the week of he was writing a book on Boko Haram. He told you 70% of people who joined Boko Haram did so because of state violence against them.
So how
feasible? So you kill all the Palestinians today, leave the children orphans, and then what's their sole purpose in life?
Well, you persuaded me. I'm not sure I needed much persuading, but that's only about
people who want to dance around the use of the word genocide or not.
But it's not genocide. And I'm going to have to say yet now, and it may never be genocide. But
and this is the problem, James. When people, the human brain can't conceptualize things that it doesn't know how to visualize or to articulate. When Pakistan was flooded a couple of years ago, it was 1/3 of the territory of Pakistan. That's the entirety of the UK. Can you envisage water everywhere when you open your door in the UK? You can't. The brain can't fathom it.
No, you can't. And that's probably a survival technique, evolutionary. Otherwise, I shall go mad, Horatio. It's a... man, thank you. That was incredibly helpful. But of course, it raises the possibility that in order to eradicate Hamas, you eradicate any potential future member of Hamas. And then you're back to where we started, on incredibly difficult waters. 12:46 is the time. We're going to have a complete change of pace for the conclusion of the programme. There are, as you know, a handful of people who have a direct line to you through this programme. All they have to do is let me know that they've got something that they want to talk about that they feel is important, and my regard for them and their record is so high that they can come on the programme pretty much whenever they want. I did indeed mean the Tamil Tigers as opposed to the Tamils, forgive me. And there aren't many people in that category, and I'm not sure any of them quite qualify for coming on between 12 and 1 on a Thursday. But during normal times, there are a few people in that. And top of the list, or very near the top of the list, is the money-saving expert Martin Lewis, who joins us after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10 to 1 is the time. It's a remarkable position to have achieved, but it is born from a deep and profound sense of public duty. I speak of Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert, and his commitment to trying to improve all of our lives, not least increasingly through interventions with politicians, the latest of which earlier this month was when the Chancellor appeared on his ITV show, the Martin Lewis Money Show, and in response to a little pressure on a few areas, the Chancellor's response was to ask Martin to write to him, and Martin joins us now. Do you think he expected you to write publicly, Martin?
Yes, I think he did. I was very clear about the interview I did on the show. And even when I introduced it on the show, I said sometimes the questions are more important than the answers. And what I wanted to put together was the main issues I was hearing from my viewers and people who get in touch with me, and put those under the Chancellor's nose to being straight, so he can't say he doesn't know about them and they haven't been raised as an issue. And it's very interesting that one of those, and by far the biggest one that came in, a third of the mailbag. So if you think of all the wide range of areas I cover, there was one issue that covered a third of all those questions. And this is starting to gain momentum. We've got a budget on the 6th of March, is child benefit. And the fundamental unfairness in the way the child benefit system is structured. I'll explain it for your listeners, if that's okay.
Take your time.
So look, here's how it works. If one parent in the family earns over £50,000, the amount of effective child benefit they get starts to be reduced. The mechanisms for reducing it we won't go into. Once they hit £60,000, they don't get child benefit, or alternatively, they have to pay child benefit back. So that means you can very clearly be in a situation that you're a single parent family earning £60,000, or you're a couple where one earns £60,000 and the other earns £10,000, and you don't get child benefit, but your next door neighbours who both earn £49,000, so combined family income £98,000, get full child benefit. Now, the Chancellor accepted to me that was structurally unfair when I pushed him on it in the interview, but he said there are many structural unfairnesses in the tax system, which you do feel like saying, yes, but you're the Chancellor, you're the person who designs them. Therefore, I can raise them, you can fix them. But I think this is perhaps the most pertinent thing on that, which was one of the, hundreds and hundreds of questions I got on this came from Alan. I just want you to listen to this, James. My son's partner tragically died 34 days after giving birth to twins. My son has taken a new job that now pays him £60,000 and is struggling with the cost of living and mortgage repayments after the loss of a second income. HMRC has asked him to repay the child benefit. This seems grossly unfair, that a couple can bring in nearly £100,000, but a single breadwinner loses out once they earn more than half of this. So his partner died, he loses a second income, he gets a small pay rise, and now, even though I suspect, reading between the lines of the question, he's earning less in total as a family, the family has lower income, he now doesn't get the child benefit help. And what you have to understand here is this has always been a problem. This started in 2013. But in 2013, £50,000 was a lot more than it is today. And it has not moved since 2013. Now, I'm asking the Chancellor to look at this in the budget. I don't think he will structurally be able to change the system and do it with what is sensible based on family income in time for the budget. I can't see, he won't be able to make an announcement this is changing. What I would do if I were Chancellor, let me phrase it that way. If I were Chancellor, heaven forbid, what I would do is I would...
Well, you're the only person that would add heaven forbid, I think, to the end of that.
I'm definitely thinking that.
Go on.
What I would do is first of all, I would increase the threshold to perhaps... You start losing it at 65 grand, you lose it fully at 75 grand, which is roughly where it would have been had it gone up with inflation since 2013. And I would say at the same time, this is a stopgap measure while we launch a consultation on the most effective way to work the system so we get rid of the structural unfairness. Now, I can't tell you the huge amount of support on this. The Times wrote a piece about it on Saturday, nothing to do with me, but I just think momentum is gathering. You've got a Conservative saying they want to give money away. They want to appeal to Middle Britain. This is the most unfair structure of tax in Britain. I think this is... I'll give you 50-50 odds this changes in the budget. 50-50.
Okay, you're on. I'll take that. And good luck. I mean, I don't know if we're going to have time to get through everything that...
getting rid of the lifetime ISA penalty, people buying...
This is for first-time buyers.
First-time buyers get a bonus on a lifetime ISA, but again, 2017, it was launched, had to buy a property up to £450,000. I know many of your listeners are in London, young people in London, 26 of the 32 London boroughs, average first-time buyer property is now over £450,000. So here's the scenario. You've maxed out your saving in the lifetime ISA for 5 years. So you've put 16 grand, for 4 years, you've put 16 grand in, and the state has added £4,000. You're excited. You're going to use it to buy a house. But the house you wanted to buy is now above £450,000. You're going to need that money for a deposit. To take it out, because you're not buying a qualifying house, not only do you not get the bonus, you have to pay the state 6.25%.
Good Lord.
Right? So you actually get less back than you put the money in.
So it's another example of thresholds not keeping up with economic change, with inflation.
It's devastating, and there's a very simple fix to that. All you do is you simply say no first-time buyer should pay a penalty. They might not get the bonus, but they shouldn't. I mean, the 18 to 39-year-olds buying a first-time property are having to pay the state 6.25% of their savings.
How much of this is driven by your understanding, and how much is driven by the size of your mailbag? Is it? I presume it's about a 52%, 48% split. Is it?
Yeah, so lifetime ISAs, I've been running that campaign for 1.5 years. Child benefit came through the mailbag.
Right.
And mid-contract above inflation broadband and price hikes, which I want them to stop. I mean, why the Chancellor allows them to bake in mid-contract price hikes above inflation, which is inflationary, I don't know. It's also anti-competitive. That's a mix. And the living loan for students, which is the other one I wrote to. I only wrote to him on the things you asked me to write on. Right. So just, James, you'll like this. I know you've only got a couple of minutes left. In England, maintenance loans were increased by 2.8% when inflation was double digits. That is a very substantial real-term cut. Yeah. Now, for years, I've had some attacks from both sides on this. I have tried to explain to people how student finance works. I've said you don't pay at the point of delivery. You pay afterwards, depending on how much you earn. So this, that's really significant, because for social mobility, you do not want people to have money in order to go to university. Now, when you start starving people out on the living loan, he wants to talk about tuition fees being frozen. That's an issue for graduates once they've left. The living loan is the money you need to go to university to live off. Who does that really hurt? People from the poorest backgrounds with family who can't bail them out. If you starve them out of the funds they have to live off at university, then it is a direct hit on social mobility. And that is exactly what we're doing at the moment. So this whole, you don't need to find money to pay up front to go to university is diminishing. And that's what the whole social equality of the income contingent loan system that our entire student finance structure is based on is about. So those real term cuts, which is what we've had over the last 4 or 5 years in England, not Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland,
yes.
Can be devastating for social mobility, and I think that needs to change and be at least index linked to inflation each year.
I presume people can read the letter in full, can they, on the website?
Yeah, it's on my website, Money Saving Expert. It's also on all my social media posts, and there's a couple of videos out there too, and I'll be continuing to push it. I just hope the Chancellor's going to listen. I've sent it to Rachel Reeves as well, I should say.
There'll be another video after this, no doubt. Very briefly, what do you expect to happen next? Does he reply to you, or do you just sit and wait for the budget like the rest of us?
We wait for the budgets. I think I've put myself 70% chance of winning on LISAs,
right?
50% chance of getting something on the child benefit charge. He's going to write to the CMA, he's told me, so I'll hear about that before, but that will take a long time. And student living loans, I give about 2%.
Martin Lewis.
Being generous.
Okay, well, we'll watch this space. Martin Lewis, always a pleasure, particularly at times when an awful lot of journalism causes despair in some quarters. Martin, flying the flag for the very, very finest brand of not just consumer journalism, as people sometimes call it, but public service, public duty journalism of the very, very highest order. Absolute pleasure to talk to you. And that's it from me for another day. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back to the whole show podcast on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. All LBC shows are there, as well as all of Global's live radio stations. Pause and rewind live radio on Global Player, where you're always in control. Download it for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, Tom Swarbrick. But now, Sheila Fogarty.
Thank you, James.
James O'Brien on LBC.